All right, starting the Grace of Kings, who's our main POV here? We have Kuni Garu. Love my boy Kuni. Kind of love watching an underdog start from the bottom, rise to the top. Interesting story. And then we're okay, another POV from later in the series. We have an evil empress. That is interesting. It's going to be a very well-rounded view of the world. And we even have, a pantheon of God POV. That's fascinating. What I really like about this is it adds a distinct flavor. And how many more POVs do we have by now? Every now and then, I have to do a review that feels legitimately intimidating to do. This is one of those times. Have you ever wanted to read a fantasy epic that makes you feel like you are Sauron's eye, and wherever your gaze lands across an island nation, misery unfolds? Well, great! I have the perfect fantasy series for you. The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. What is the Dandelion Dynasty? It's a fantasy Eastern-inspired epic series in the grimdark genre that manages to pull off a stylistic feel like few others, while telling the story at first of a man's rise to power, but as the series goes on, instead the story of a dynasty, through its rise, its highs, and its lows. And if I had one thing to say about the approach that Ken Liu executed here, it's that it is going to turn off a lot of readers because of how stylized it is. This is a series that has a hyper-specific vision, and especially after the first book, instead of maybe easing off on some elements that could be a turnoff to a reader, leans into them, but it's doing it for a specific reason. A very strange comparison that's going to feel like, what the hell? If you've seen the movie Good Time, starring Robert Pattinson, that is a movie designed to give you an anxiety attack. It's not meant to be like, oh, this is the standard hero's journey enjoyable experience. And instead, it's just making you uncomfortable. That is the point of the film. The Dandelion Dynasty isn't trying to make you uncomfortable, but it's trying to read like a history text, more and more so as it goes on. And it achieves this fantastically. In fact, in my notes repeatedly, I have it said, written out, boy, I wish that actual history, like the ones I had been taught in high school, were written by Ken Liu. Because as a massive history fan, this is how it should be done. It just happens to be a fake fantasy epic. Not fake. You know what I mean? Like, it's not real. But after the first book and the establishment of this dynasty ends, that Sauron's eye begins its sweeping gaze, and you don't get as much of the personal connection you might be used to in your girthy fantasy stories. That's not an inherent negative, though, and I think for many readers, myself included, will end up just being something distinct and interesting. I don't mean to sound all highbrow, this is advanced fantasy. No, you can make this your first fantasy book if this sounds interesting to you, but it's not standard fantasy. The best way I can put it, you know how in the Wheel of Time, every book starts with you following like a breeze that eventually comes across one of our main characters? This is the story of that breeze, except it becomes a hurricane. This is a specific vision and an execution on it in a hyper-stylized way. Now let's get into it. Now this takes us to me, before we get into the rest of the review, actually establishing what exactly is the story of the Dandelion Dynasty. And this is going to be a bit harder to actually establish than your typical fantasy series due to the stylistic decision to make this such a sweeping vision. But fortunately, it does start a bit more traditional in the first book, The Grace of Kings, because we start following a bit of a scoundrel. Kuni Garu, as we're going to call him, KG, is a bandit within the Zana Empire, a tyrannical, awful government within the island nation of Dara. And in this first book, Grace of Kings, he goes on an adventure. Where he ends up teaming up with a more established man within the Empire, Matazindu. And together they end up actually leading a revolution and going on to overthrow and take down the Zana Empire. But that is only like the first conflict within the Grace of Kings. That's why I'm actually willing to talk about it here in just like a setup of the series. Because as the first book goes on, the philosophy behind the Dandelion Dynasty becomes more clear. And that is that victory is not the end of a story. And these two's visions of a future diverges. Civil war, conflict, conflict, conflict. And the first book especially really delves into themes of loyalty and power and how distance, failures in communication, which is different than language, can result in schism. But book 2 picks up with our new established empire under KG. And I won't get into story specifics from here because I do want to allow you to go on this adventure yourself. But the biggest threat he is facing is not only schisms within his own empire, but an additional outside invader threat called the Liuku and their flying Garas. I'm going to need you to pretend that's way more intimidating than it is. And what I love, what Ken Liu so successfully pulls off, is how the separation and distance between these people ends up resulting in an incredibly dynamic setup to the war that ensues. There are technological differences, cultural differences, and all of these layers that allow the Liuku to make incredible advances into this empire, but also result into them, let's just call it, not vibing with the locals. And the second book is titled The Wall of Storms because that is what the Liuku managed to push through and introduces a ticking clock element that is effective to varying degrees as the books go on, which takes us to book 3. And in the middle of this war, the Veiled Throne, which is the third book, makes a rather interesting decision to, during this ongoing continental conflict, as often does actually happen in war, stall. This, if you look into history, goes on all the time. There are wars that just, like, for seasons or even a full year, everyone's just kind of regrouping, and they're all like, a lot of you died, a lot of us died. We're doing some stuff, you're doing some stuff, we took some land, you took back some land. Let's rest. And while court politics has always been a major factor within the Dandelion Dynasty, this is where that angle of the storytelling rises to the absolute top. And here is where, like, yes, in the first book, you're following the story of Kuni Garu. In the second book, it kind of becomes like that first big pullout where you're following the story of this whole nation. And in the third book, this whole story just becomes like little vignettes of life, day in the life. Here's something going on. This is something going on within the invaders, within the locals, within children that are being born from the two. And it is the most just scattered fantasy epic I have ever come across, hands down. That's not a criticism, but it is a choice. And book 4, Speaking Bones, thematically really leans in heavily into, if you're having a conflict that is going on for years and years, there are going to be changes that inevitably affect both cultures, changing them forever. And there are going to be loyalties, and all of these themes previously talked about handled just as tactfully to bring in conflict and new angles that make the fourth book maybe my favorite. I would say the third book I found myself kind of struggling with the most, not because it's necessarily bad in any way, just I made the mistake of binging this series, which we'll talk more about later. And the fourth book really takes a lot of the promise of the third book, and when you learn these two books were split, it kind of makes sense and finally delivers. And by the end of the fourth book, it truly does not feel like you are following any one character. And instead, it feels like you are following the character of Dara, the actual island itself. Like, this is the story of the land at this point, and it is just a different taste, y'all. And I don't just mean like literally the land. We also get like the people, the technological advancement. There is like an aggressive amount of this series dedicated to tech. We go from what feels like, yeah, Han Dynasty stuff to like early-ish versions of computing, if you know what primitive computing actually looked like. It's again like, damn, Ken Liu, I like what you're doing. But just keep in mind, if you are going into the Dandelion Dynasty, in the first book, you struggled with how much it did not feel like a traditional narrative following Kuni Garu, that only amplifies by the end of the series to a extreme extent. This is a story of conflict. It is from top to bottom kind of a commentary, an interpretation of how risings and fallings in society occur, and starts usually on the tiny seed level, and it's about the patience of watching that grow into an oak that eventually falls on the royal palace. And this is done through examinations of minutia within Dara, the island archipelago, I hope I'm saying that word, we are following, where especially after the first book, we will jump to just an individual farmer and see some observations around nature, or jump again, and we get explorations of changes in tech, economy, spirituality, academia, gender, class, all of these just acting as the little butterfly wings that then have monumental impact on revolutions that overthrow or destroy what we've seen built for hundreds, if not thousands of pages. Because again, this is not about one man's successful rise to power, and instead it's the story of a dynasty that just happens to start with one man, Kuni Garu. And you need to go into the Dandelion Dynasty and just immediately take your preconceptions about what it is to be a protagonist, crumple it up, and throw it away, because we're not on a hero's journey in the long term. And instead, you know, like there's that typical thing brought up by George R. R. Martin with Lord of the Rings. It's like, what's Aragorn's tax policy? And instead it's, how would Gondorian people look back on Aragorn 3 generations down the line if, yeah, some of his policies didn't work out? He was overthrown and propaganda was started about him. We know he was a pretty good ruler. He tried his best, but no one sees all perfectly, and so cracks within his reign or outside influences he couldn't have controlled results in decisions that were right in the moment but turned out to be wrong in the long run. And so all of a sudden you see Aragorn, or in this case Kuni Garu, being called a warmonger or a fool. All of this can be summed up by one of my favorite quotes. I believe that was in the 4th book. History has no plot, and kings do not follow character arcs. And if you are someone who wants just like a book with banger lines in it, you'll be feasting. Legends and perceptions around rulers that become believed while we know the truth long after their death. That is one of the major ideas that is played with throughout the Dandelion Dynasty, and it has no loyalty to right or wrong. We watch as history becomes myth, myth fades to legend, and I almost wheel it. Nope. Stay focused. Stay on the train. Land's pretty cool. All right, Dandelion Dynasty. There's like obvious angles to cracks in monolithic power structures that Ken Liu explores and exploits to have downfalls, of course. Kuni Garu could be like a good man and leader, but someone 4 rungs down in power could be a corrupt bastard. Duh. That's something that goes from the beginning to the end of the series and is in almost any good examination of power structure story you'll come across. But well beyond that, we know in the real world, there can be people with all of the good intentions that come to power and end up being tyrants. And that might not be reflecting exactly Kuni Garu, but his descendants, his heirs. The road to hell is paved in good intentions, and outside influences, unexpected problems that occur can take someone who is a bit idealistic and shift them into a villain. Now, there is an angle to morality with the Dandelion Dynasty that I want to delve into specifically, because as I said, this is a grimdark series, and you are going to be following several morally gray to flat out evil characters, including like an empress who essentially goes on like a political killing spree. And Ken Liu is quite deft with the POV and justifies actions. You kind of feel like anyone from the right angle, no matter how much you may personally disagree with their actions, is certainly understandable in their own boots, as any great antagonist should be. Yet, it's not like your typical grimdark series. And one of the reasons I specifically want to get into this is so often in fantasy circles when you see someone post like, I just finished A Song of Ice and Fire, what should I read next? Very often you will see the top response be the Dandelion Dynasty, and for good reason. They are both inspired from real-world history. A Song of Ice and Fire is the War of the Roses, and Dandelion Dynasty, from what I've read online, is the Han Dynasty. Yet the similarities in major ways kind of in there, and it comes down to Ken Liu's view on karma, the world, and so much more that go well beyond the stylistic differences I've already talked about in terms of that macro level scale. A Song of Ice and Fire, despite it being undisputedly a fantasy epic, is still a deeply personal story where Martin is willing to have the bad guys win. And for all we know, the book series is going to go in a different direction than the show, and some deplorable people are going to end out on top. In the Dandelion Dynasty, that is not the case, and you should not go in expecting a similar view on just an uncaring universe. As I've said, there are a pantheon of gods actively within the narrative. They are not necessarily right or wrong, and as Kin Lu has done with his cultures, they feel like they think differently than us. Yet, he still seems to be implementing that long arc of justice you will hear talked about in the real world, where things fall apart, they go wrong, terrible things occur, but in general, the march of history is towards the better. This is not a dispassionate series. Contradictory to so much might be implied by what I have established with the choices setting up the Dandelion Dynasty. It is one that is deeply spiritual and has a view that there is a right and wrong in the world that is not defined by culture, religion, and instead comes down to the individual. And that even could bother some grimdark fans, I'm sure of it even, who want to just see just whoever is willing to sacrifice more, be worse, come out on top. And that does happen on an individual basis within the Dandelion Dynasty, but on that long arc, certainly is not the case. And I really want to hit one last time that spiritual note. From the character to the historic level, the Dandelion Dynasty is developing its narrative from a understanding, a connection with the universe, a wider, broader stroke into the realm beyond the physical, whether how it influences our mind, our mental condition, and others around us. Evil breeds evil, but shadow is washed out by light, by forgiveness, by understanding. The few good leaders can do more good than the many awful ones. And after hearing that, you should very much so understand how this is deeply different than a lot that exists within the grimdark realm. It's why I almost hesitate to call the Dandelion Dynasty grimdark, but it would be stupid not to with the level of graphic, horrific, war crime level events that are described. And you as the reader are trusted by Kin Lu to understand really beyond the text where these problems are growing and emerging and how they're going to end up affecting the top rung or not. And instead it can be a top-down situation. You just need to be on the constant watch to see if it's something as big as a famine building in the countryside or as small as a beer gut on somebody who used to be known as a warrior. All are indications that you need to marinate on, because I'm thrilled to say the Dandelion Dynasty is one of those fantasy series that trusts you as the reader. You just have to be willing to speak the series' language, because it is going to be communicating with you in a very different way. And if book one is not necessarily your cup of tea, do not try and push forward, because once we get into book two, it doubles down. In fact, Kin Lu is embracing a tell don't show philosophy at times that he's able to pull off if you trust him, because knowing the rules makes you good. Knowing how to break them makes you great. It's just also going to make it so you're polarizing. And there is so many battle and action sequences where we're told like, the riders come in from the north, but that general actually promoted the people under him based off who he liked, not on actual merit. And so he underperformed in battle and failed. And you're like, wow, I sure got told that, but it works because it's like this consistent style where, because we are doing that pull out to the macro level, push into the micro, you kind of do end up feeling like belonging to this pantheon of gods who are actual characters in the story as well, and you're just able to see what's important, who you gotta look at. But I'm aware this has sounded like I'm making a lot of excuses for a story, that you could just be taking a lot of what I'm saying and bend it to a criticizing angle. And I'm going to agree with that to an extent. I, at times, was really struggling to not only keep track of all the different diatribes we go on in the side where we're following a character who will never come up again and just getting a little anecdote here that implies something over there. It becomes genuinely taxing. Oh, we are soaring high in the air. This is awesome. I've never been this high up in the clouds. This is really neat. Thanks, God. It's a nice perspective to take in this archipelago from. That is getting closer. Oh, Jesus. Why? Why did you take me in that fast? Oh, I felt that impact in my ass. Was that an allegory about a guy ripping his own teeth out? What the Jesus, we were talking about weather patterns and shit. Good God, just don't do it again. Oh. Wait, no, is that a princess selling herself? Oh. But I promise you, if you push through ones that maybe just feel too out of left field or you didn't connect with enough to follow what's going on, you will find plenty within them as well that, yes, are just enticing on a storytelling level, but also feel like lessons you could take something from. There's this great examination of perspective that occurs over a game where to have more pieces on a board of a game where someone needs to capture other people's pieces, a character runs out of white, so someone who's assisting him and encouraging him to go further into the game begins knocking out their own teeth and handing them in. And it's like, was that cheating? Was it determination? Was it smart, brutish? You can look at it from all these different angles, and then that reflects into the wider story, the commentary on the leaders we've had and the decisions they've made about the falsehood of truth in history. Yet, the Dandelion Dynasty also warns against tyrants and those who refuse to believe in truth. And I would say it's more than fair to call the Dandelion Dynasty as a whole blunt. Blunt isn't always bad for that. I think messaging in terms of themes can be tactful and blunt simultaneously. But even in its writing style, as I said, it's just going to tell you things at times. And so if you don't like that, don't pick this up. But I would not take that so far as to say that there's actually any criticism of the prose here. Prose are misunderstood frequently in the writing space, where some people try to take it down to the sentence by sentence level, which sure, there's an angle there, but overall prose is a much bigger picture. And it's about how 1,000 sentences come together to imprint a meaning, a message, a story onto you. And on that level, the Dandelion Dynasty swings with the best. And a way to prove this, you can go into even the highest praised prose books within fantasy, Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and find individual sentences that are maybe a bit too simplistic, not grammatically perfect. But the reason they are praised so much is because it's a consistency, and it makes you fall deeper and deeper into the world that it's trying to create. And oh, buddy, that's probably the strongest angle to Ken Liu's writing, because he manages to wield communication with you as a reader like few can even fathom on a creative level. There are patterns of thought, ways of thinking between cultures that look at what Robert Jordan did with the Aiel, where it's yeah, they have a different way of life, injects steroids and is no, they have different perceptions on what's truth, right, wrong, everything. And so it then informs the conflict where you as the reader are yeah, of course they're never going to get along. These people think the way those people exist is just horrific. And if you're going oh, that's just reflective of the real world, fucking yeah. But it's captured vividly. And that's what I mean by Ken Liu knew how to break the rules to go from good to great. He manages to be consistent, thought through, and decisive with why he is making each of these decisions. And the end result is this experience where it's halfway between watching a Rome documentary from the History Channel back when the History Channel was actually good, and a Wheel of Time or a Stormlight archive. It is if those two had a baby. Yet, I would then critique and say the Dandelion Dynasty occasionally does put all of these positives in a back seat and just become a little too preachy for my taste, which is unfortunate because usually what it's preaching, I agree with, but especially with commentary around tyranny, it can get overt. At one point, a villain even says don't accept facts and truth, accept my visions of the future and what I say. And it's this person is a tyrant. Maybe don't say it out loud. Except beyond just moments like that bothered me, the whole play with those ideas specifically within the story are actually magnificent. And those that are even in power wield it in terrible ways or with good intentions accidentally make awful things happen, end up becoming some of the most enticing parts of Dandelion Dynasty. And the end results of what Dandelion Dynasty is doing with tyranny are gut-wrenching because if you know history, culture actually is a tremendous source of conflict, specifically cultural difference. And I'm not trying to say that in any kind of stickler, one is better than the other way, or, cultural diffusion is great. I love humanity. We're all beautiful beings. But tyrants use culture as a source of fear. And once we get later on in the series and outside invaders are holding land within Dara and the people are having kids with other people and we see some cultural diffusion happening, that's going to result in those tyrants having a very negative reaction to that because they want to preserve their own view of the world, their way. They're better. We invaded. Those are people are weak. And this is where we get into genocide and cultural extermination. As I said, this is grimdark. No matter how hard horrible leaders try, people who meet other people are going to do what people do. And despite the best efforts of those who might try and control them, cultures will blend. That is a consistency throughout history. Once cultures meet, they exchange ideas, they exchange blood, and you get a blend. But to those who want to maintain their power and instill a sense of superiority in their people as a way of maintaining their own control over them, it's a tremendous threat. And so you end up seeing fear be used as a weapon, propaganda used to twist humans against other humans based off of arbitrary differences. And that is why I think it is just too thin of a term to say that, oh, Dandelion Dynasty is great at culture. No, this is the most vivid realization of conflict through cultural diffusion, history, philosophy, just day in the lifeism of the individual, all the way up to the kings, the leaders, the emperors I have come across. And plopped directly into the middle of this is my own personal biggest complaint with the Dandelion Dynasty. I do believe Ken Liu is a genius, and as a genius, he made some decisions that, for my own personal experience, I have a really hard time swallowing. Though, I understand some people could really enjoy a series that is so dedicated to historical realism suddenly shifting gears into a cooking competition for several hundred pages. Oh, that was a lot of blood we just learned about being spilled from the Dara people by the Yuku invaders. And it will forever shape and scar the continent of Dara. But now, I'm going to show you how these restaurants chop the shit out of these carrots. And it's equally important. In fact, it's going to take more time here. This is the biggest what the fuck I have possibly had in epic fantasy. I've read a whole lot of them, and never before have I gone from just a few chapters distant to watching a tyrant burn a whole bunch of people alive because they dared do something that hides the old ways from the new conquerors, to these two restaurants are having a cooking battle and it's going to stick around and last. There's even like giant displays for the viewing audience to see the meals and an equivalent to a microphone, and which restaurant's gonna come out on top? Except there's not even like a great dedication examination to the food that makes your mouth water and gut rumble, and it's just what? It's so bizarre. It's borderline experimental. It is in the best way I can put it, in the middle of reading Not Quite Black Company, but like 2 down notches from that. If you did just take Legends and Lattes and throw that mother in there. It's so weird. Don't get me wrong, there's some dark stuff to it. There's espionage, kind of like this back and forth knife under the table play, but it's like pouring steak sauce on ice cream for me, dog. I'm out. I don't even entirely get the point of putting it in. There's some like thematic stuff I understand, but in terms of like the narrative, well, I could just put this other story in there real quick. But I've been taking a moment to just talk about specifics I didn't like. Let's talk about some specifics I did, especially later in the series when the invaders become more prevalent. We get dragons, except they're not called dragons, and instead, I almost hesitate to say this so late into reading so much fantasy, but these are some distinct, interesting feeling dragons. They rely on like gas within them to be able to fly. They're kind of based in like a more scientific approach and not described in a way that feels dragon-esque, and become representative of a ton of the cultural clashing that's happening, not only between the existing cultures, but the invaders' cultures that's now struggling to stay monolithic within this new land. And again, it's just another example of how if you have this big vision, making sacrifices of every single element to bend towards serving that can end up working in your favor massively. I also want to praise the Dandelion Dynasty's diversity of combat. It's not my favorite battle writing of all time, not even close, but we get everything from like frozen landscape, ship to ship warfare, air battles, gritty down on the dirt, submarine style stuff. Kin Lu understood that, hey, if we just do the same clashes in the battlefields again and again, could feel a bit tired. And so he is implementing technology, different strategies, and manipulation in a way that it feels fresh every time. So while it's like on the technical side, in the actual visualization and new flavor, right up there with the cooking competition flavor-wise. God damn it. In the crucial moments within the Dandelion Dynasty, when we return to following the most powerful people, even like the mustache twirling evil ones compared to the more, kind of good ones, though good and bad within Dandelion Dynasty is always polluted a little bit. I've never felt the weight and responsibility of power more. The hard questions of being a leader are at the forefront continually. For example, if you're a leader and your land is currently divided, but peace has been found in a tenuous treaty and the economy's doing well, booming even, is it worth going to war again just to free the people that have been conquered? You could be seen as a tyrant. In fact, there's a whole generation of people below you who, through the cultural exchange that's going on, are now making more money than ever. And the equivalent I could think of is like, God forbid, Germany did successfully capture, Europe in World War II, but America still had its boom in the 50s. Would we have gone to war with all of Europe to overthrow the people we saw as evil? Obviously, I'm like, yeah, let's kill the Nazis. But as a leader, you could lose, and even more could be taken from you. And the winner of such conflicts is often the person willing to sacrifice the most, and your enemy is willing to sacrifice everything. There's just a million decisions made throughout the Dandelion Dynasty to keep it from being like far from my favorite of all time, but definitely something that just hits new. And I'm always grateful when I find that in my career, because after consuming so many, something distinct is more valuable than ever to me. And I think my biggest regret with the Dandelion Dynasty as a whole is actually binging it, just getting through it in this go that I did pretty much for like late December, all of January, because it was too much stylization at once. I started feeling like one of those YouTubers that watches like all of Tarantino's films in a row, and you can tell by like the last entry, they're getting just a little tired of Tarantino. I recommend, if you do want to take on the Dandelion Dynasty, break it up. Because one, it is a lot. Each book delivers just such a deluge of different perspectives and ideas that it actually benefits, at least in my opinion from someone who binged it, from maybe being spread out a little. I'm not trying to say Kin Lu is like one note in any way. There's, as we've clearly demonstrated, a diversity of tone here, but it is one style. And so consuming one style all at once can start to get redundant. And yeah, on a negative note, I've tried to think of a nicer way to say this because I don't mean it as bluntly as this is going to sound, but if you are someone who needs a really well structured, a really well paced story, you will hate this. This is not about having like the typical third act climax and then everything's done. And instead it's up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, because we're watching little conflicts sprout into bigger things, but not always just in like quick sequential order. And so it's structurally just chaos. That being said though, if you are a fan of the creative decision at the end of the show Pantheon, where time jumps are kind of used to explore the ramifications, the end results of so much of what came before, I think, and maybe this is like the most important thing for you as a reader, you'll really end up liking the end. This is a story where we get catharsis. I know it sounds kind of strange because it's like you're watching the story of a land. How can there be such a distinct end? And there's not. It's not like, okay, and now history's over. In fact, there's a ton of implications of what's to come. And with how you care about certain characters and stuff, not every character has like their arc's completed, but instead it just feels like the right moment. The best thing I can compare it to is the ending of an album where you're like, oh, I could go for more of that, but okay, that album's over. Good. But the final idea is kind of just the ability to walk away as a leader. When are you done? When is power just In fact, there's a final line that got to me where she would wield power, but power would never wield her again. I'm paraphrasing and actually write that down. I was taking a quick note at the gym, but it's something along those lines. And it ended on it where I was like, that's a good end. That's the note. And you just feel like, yes, I'm exhausted as an elder now of the Dandelion Dynasty because I've been through it all. It's a good moment just to go, that was an experience. Flawed greatness comes to mind. Flawed greatness where it is going to be irksome. It's not going to be easy to consume. This is not a Stormlight archive where it's just whoo-hoo-hoo. Instead, you need to think. You need to slow down, maybe go back because you'll be confused. It challenges you ideologically and just on a writing level. That's all fine. It's just something that's not going to be as mass appeal. All right, but the review coming to an end, though, I want to go ahead and give my final number rating because this is something I really struggled with when talking about Dandelion Dynasty. Keep it smooth here, Daniel, because I try to articulate my thoughts on how much I respect or admire a series, dislike, all the criticisms and nuance within the words I actually say. But the number at the end of the video kind of ends up reflecting my just enjoyment. Like, what did I feel going through this? And I certainly went through the entire emotional gambit with Dandelion Dynasty, but I honestly did struggle at times too. It was more of a commitment read rather than one like, let's say, Dungeon Crawler Carl, which is just having fun with it. And I respect this so much. I would consider this truly one of the most epic fantasy series I have come across. But in terms of my rating at the end of the day, don't smack into the shelf. I'm feeling a 7.5 with a caveat. In terms of like my respect for what Ken Liu pulled off, it is through the roof. Do I ever see myself rereading Dandelion Dynasty? Not necessarily. It is different. I am so happy I did it. I want to discuss it for hours, but especially because I did the books back to back to back to back, it ended up kind of feeling a bit sluggish at times. So this is a 7.5 with an additional badass seal of a goblin approval. I'm really glad this exists in the fantasy landscape, and many people will probably look at this as their favorite if their style aligns with what was attempted here. And now for a majority of the rest of 2025, I'm going to be focusing on like fantasy one-offs or smaller series. This channel has been so dedicated to epics that every now and then I look back and I'm like, man, I spent so long on Dungeon Crawler Carl or Malazan. There's still a ton of things I want to get through. 2025 from here on out is going to be the year of just either like series where you can just do the first book and it's good, or standalones or smaller series that I can just out. Because in the time it took me to read Dandelion Dynasty, I feel like I could have done 10 books. Not in a critical way of Dandelion Dynasty, it was just asking more of me. But this has just been my review of the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, edited by Ben, who I'll have linked down below. Be sure to check out his channel as well. Phenomenal guy. Also someone who is struggling with the LA fires, so please wish him all the good things in the comments down below. Though last he told me he's safe and sound, let's just send him virtual goblin hugs. And have a great one, y'all. Pick up Dandelion Dynasty in the pinned comment with the link and all that. Bye.